So I'm joined by David Walker, who's CEO of DNVGL, which is the world's largest renewables consultancy and also, of course, specialists in certification. So, David, I mean, can we start with, first of all, how big are problems as you see them? How big are problems of integration?
Well, I think the problems are at different scales, as you just outlined, between distributed generation and also larger scale generation. At the larger scale, one of the issues I think that we've seen as renewables have started to penetrate the market in a much bigger way is around what I call a number of gaps. One is a planning gap, one is a location gap, and one is flexibility gap. But I actually wonder to some extent, this conversation we're actually having is renewables have been singled out to some extent to be something different. But I would argue from what we've heard today that with the penetration increasing all the time, that renewables are mainstream and that grid companies and indeed government are going to think of them that way rather than think of them as a little bit special and how they're integrated into the grid. But some of the problems that have occurred, if you like...
So let me just pick you up there, because they're not mainstream in the sense that they don't run along the wires that we've already got. So they do produce a problem. I can't let you dismiss it that quickly.
More and more, of course, as integration occurs and as they get integrated into grid, they become part of the mainstream. But so there's a number of gaps that I mentioned. So first of all is the planning gap, because one of the things that happens often is that, to build a new wind park, for instance, say here in the UK, it often takes between 3 to 5 years to actually, finally get that on the ground from between concept to actually being put on production. If you go offshore, it can take between 5 and 7 years. But the planning cycle historically that grids worked on were more like 10 years. So when renewables did start to penetrate the grid, that was one of the problems, was that if you like, we were building wind parks and eventually solar parks, which weren't fitting in with the normal cycle of how a distribution or a transmission system operator would actually run their process. So immediately we then have a slight disconnect in terms of how things can be interconnected. The second one is location gap. I mean, I think as everyone's well aware of this particular problem, is that often away from the rooftop solar, that sometimes the new wind parks coming on, or particularly if they're offshore, or they may be up in the highlands, the borderlands, or areas that are particularly windy, they're not close to where the grid was, because the grid, of course, was designed to be near the major cities, but a lot of the locations of large-scale developments of renewables were in remote locations. And so the grid had to be extended and in some cases reinforced to get there, and that was historically also a problem. And we've seen that, as you say, offshore in particular, who then actually is also responsible for building that grid to the offshore, because that varies by country. We've seen in Germany, it's the obligation of the transmission system operator to go out offshore to meet the wind park, and in other places, it's the wind farm that has to come to the shore and expense the process. So there are issues there on who pays and who's responsible for the connection of the wind farm to the grid as well. And the last one, I think, is this flexibility gap, if you like, and that's how does due to the variability of renewables, although I would also argue here the increasing predictability of renewables, but the variability of renewable generation, how is that going to be covered from the grid balancing standpoint is the third thing. So you've got different things, planning cycles, the location of the generation versus the traditional historical grid, and then you've got how do you actually cope with the actual renewables coming onto the grid themselves.
And how do you see a country like the UK, for instance, just talk about the UK for a moment, how do you see the UK meeting up to these challenges? I mean, it is phenomenally complicated. I think for people who are outside the bubble in which this room exists, it is so complicated that politicians sort of wish they can sort of snap their fingers and make things happen. But once you start pulling at the threads, all sorts of other things unravel, don't they? I mean, how do you see things improving?
Well, I think the planning gap is an interesting one where, of course, getting anything done in the UK often requires inquiries, or there are objections locally, etc., to not in my backyard or whatever you may wish to call it, that people are concerned about a wind park or a solar farm being in their area. So that often, I think, compared to some other countries, takes a bit longer than perhaps certainly developers would actually like. So it requires...
Well, they won't have to worry about wind farms being in their area anymore, will they?
Well, perhaps not.
No, just say no. Thank you.
Yes, right, and given the new legislation. But I mean, at the end of the day, we still need the energy. So that has certainly been been an issue. I think it's become a political issue as visual pollution has become an issue. So that's been one thing. In terms of location, yes, we've had to extend the grid. As I say, although there are obviously wind farms and solar parks close to cities and land that the public use extensively, a lot of the, if you take Wales, for instance, I think it's got the highest density of windmills of any country in the world. And a lot of them are obviously in fairly remote locations that required integration into grid, the same in the Scottish borderlands, etc. So we've had to extend the grid. We've also discussed is it coming on at transmission level, is it coming on at distribution level. So it creates a number of issues. But I think, overall, as we've heard and seen today, the UK has been building up its renewables capacity over the last few years. And I think, that I hope it's something that will obviously continue. But, offshore is probably, for offshore wind is probably the future as we've heard.
Can we talk a little bit about costs? Because so far, the full costs of renewables don't appear to be showing in the costs that turn up. The government has instigated an investigation, its own investigation, into the full cost of renewables, which will surely show that the cost of solar and wind are actually higher than they appear to be at the moment. What sort of thing do you expect to come out of that review, and what do you think the consequences will be? I mean, because after all, even nuclear needs a backup. For when it goes down. So nothing exists in a vacuum. It's very difficult to apportion costs on the grid, isn't it?
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at it from a renewables perspective of integration, there are probably at least 4 different categories of cost that go into the integration. First of all, there's a certain amount of capital in the actual project itself to make it prepared to be integrated into the grid. But as I've mentioned, the grid extension to wherever the wind farm or the solar park actually is another part of the cost. Next part is the actual system. I think what you're getting at is that the system has to adapt to increasing volume of renewables coming onto the grid. There are many studies, though, I think, that show that there's a recent IRENA study, for instance, that showed most grids can absorb 20 to 30% of renewables in the energy mix. DNVGL actually did a study for the EU, which showed that in certain countries, arguably up to 60% of the energy mix could be from renewables without it having a major additional cost to the grid. So these additional costs that we're talking about may be, as you've said, backup capacity, could be storage, could be interconnectors, etc. And then there's if you like, the operating cost element in the day. If the wind isn't blowing or it's nighttime, is how do you then, if you like, substitute for the renewable energy, which then has a cost as well. So there are multiple elements overall in the cost structure that have got to be looked at. If you look at, again, the IRENA study, I think it said, for instance, that after that 30% penetration, you're talking about between 10 and 15 pounds per megawatt hour of additional cost to absorb those renewables through those different methodologies that I've just described. So, there is potentially that extra cost, but arguably offsetting that, and this is where I think, if the government is truly going to look at it holistically, it has to look at the offsetting of carbon and other issues that renewables obviously bring to the system. So I hope that their study actually does look at every angle to it, rather than just the physical cost.
I'm sure it will be the world's best study on the topic so far. The 30% you quote is a widely quoted figure for the stability of the system. The UK is projecting to get almost 100% of its electricity from non-fossil fuel sources by 2030, at least 70% left. Carbon capture and storage is looking flaky still. We're struggling to build one nuclear power station, let alone replace an entire fleet. What's your thoughts on that?
In terms of where's it going to come from?
Yes, where's it going to come from?
Well, again, I think it depends obviously on the government's policies. I mean, from our perspective as a company, we're obviously looking at offshore wind becoming an increasing part of that if we can drive down the costs. I think it's already been quoted today that offshore wind is maybe between 20 and 40% more expensive than onshore wind. So we are doing a lot of work with the industry to try and drive that down and learn as much as we can, for instance, from the oil and gas business to make sure that the operating side of things are done, the installation costs are as low as possible, and basically make that a bigger contributor to the overall mix.
But it's slow, isn't it? I mean,
at the moment, it's gone slower than we would have hoped. It does have the benefit, though, of largely being over the horizon, getting away from some of the other societal issues, if we can get offshore wind to actually work. Rooftop solar is another area I think we've talked about, the prices coming down so low that I think we also need to look at, again, in the UK in a more broadly based source than perhaps we have historically. I just got back last week from being in Singapore, and I think they're going to plaster the entire country. Okay, it's a city-state, and indeed every reservoir with solar panels to make themselves as self-sufficient as possible. So rooftop solar, I think, has a bigger role to play going forward as well.
Have you seen international examples of where other countries are integrating renewables into the system better than you think we're doing it here? Are there any exemplars out there? I mean, Germany is regularly quoted.
Germany is regularly quoted. I guess another area is not so much a country, or it's more of a state of California is going really, I think, quite aggressively in terms of its mix. And improving the amount of renewable energy that's included in that. So it has a very high, both wind and solar, 30+% in their energy mix. The idea is that should increase. And they're also backing it up, for instance, by putting in a fair amount of storage as well.
I mean, we talked about storage briefly earlier on when we were in the green room. Tell me about the role that storage has to play here.
So storage can play a number of multiple roles, I think, for benefit to the system, probably at three different levels. So there's the very macro level, if you like, providing sort of national grid support, which could be pump storage on a large scale, such as Norway has. I mean, Norway is often quoted as being the battery of Europe, through the various interconnectors that it has with Europe, providing that to support the grids in the adjacent EU countries. At the micro level, there's the Tesla Powerwall and things like that people could have in their home, which provides basically backup or allows them to go off-grid at peak times.
Still very, very expensive.
Still very small and still relatively expensive, again. But again, it's one of these things that will come down the cost curve over time. The other area of those storage is, if you like, in the middle here, which is before the meter, which would be, if you like, part of the grid system overall. And that can provide a number of services. It can provide ancillary services to the grid in terms of frequency control, voltage control, etc. But it obviously can also offset solar at nighttime or wind energy as well. So large-scale grid-size storage is something that we can see potentially developing.
You're talking about, I went up to, there's a sort of warehouse in Leighton Buzzard or somewhere like that I went to visit, which is a sort of warehouse full of battery.
Correct.
That sort of thing. Yes,
and we're seeing that. I mean, there's a goal. I think it's 1.2 gigawatt of storage capacity in California. Germany has set a target. The government here has said that storage will be one of the areas that we will develop as a country. I think it's one of the 8 technologies that George Osborne recently said is something that we will develop. But it's large-scale, industrial-scale battery storage is what we'll be talking about there.
Right. Okay. Look, we've got 5 minutes left. Let me open up to any questions or comments. So, gentlemen here, may I take a couple if I can? Is there a second? No. Let's just stick with this gentleman first. Just say your name and what you do, if you'd be so kind. Microphone is heading your way.
Good afternoon. I'm Chris Ambler. I'm Chief Exec of Jersey Electricity in the Channel Islands. I just wondered if you could give a view on how you think the traditional power utilities should respond to the threat of distributed generation from renewables.
Okay, it's a very good question. Because
there's some very hefty consultancies lying on this one. You do realise, don't you?
It's a very good question, because I guess I've heard a number of different answers to that question, ranging from an expectation that they will no longer exist as they're currently constituted in again 10, 15, 20 years' time, to the fact that several of them are obviously reinventing themselves to provide services, if you like, rather than being a utility generator. So I think it depends obviously on the circumstances and how forward-looking the utility might actually be. But I think we're seeing, if you look at very large-scale companies like E.ON in Germany, splitting itself into 2 separate companies, if you like, with the conventional assets off to one side and focusing on renewables as its growth vehicle going forward. We're seeing other companies, I say, looking at providing services. So if you like, it's almost like insurance to the grid into the flexibility market, or in other words, going beyond capacity markets into a broader thing. So I think we'll see a variety of evolutions, but I think we'll also see some companies may well fall by the wayside as well. It will depend, I think, how they handle this mix of technology, which is accelerating quite quickly, both in terms of renewable development and storage. It will depend on what happens from a regulatory standpoint. It'll depend whether people are still willing to give them capital to develop themselves. And I think it will depend on their boards recognizing how all these issues coming together, along with, as been mentioned, the sort of digitalization of our age and big data and smart data, is how they're going to adapt and become perhaps more service companies rather than purely generating and transmission companies.
Have you still got the microphone, that gentleman? Has he still got the microphone? Okay, could we give him the microphone? But I'd just be interested to hear. I mean, I don't very often hear from Jersey in the energy debate. I'd just be interested to hear your perspective on where you think things are going.
Where, in Jersey or in the UK?
Yeah, both.
The world.
Well, I mean, Jersey's obviously quite a different situation because we're not part of the UK system. We're outside the UK. We're outside the EU.
Are you installing a lot of solar?
I mean, interestingly, we're not, but largely because we don't have access to the subsidy regime that is in place in the UK. But
okay, I think Thierry is still at the back. If you need
I did actually try and chase him out of the room, but I couldn't quite catch him. I mean, I think it's inevitable that solar will develop, and we've heard already this morning that we're not that far from grid parity. So it's definitely sort of out there. It's definitely it's potentially disruptive. And I think, as your speaker said, I think there's a few different alternative responses that the traditional utilities could make to it. But it's a real dilemma, actually. It's a real challenge, I think, because it's...
We're at a moment, aren't we? We're at a sort of hinge moment.
Yeah, we are, and it's I think if storage develops as a viable, cost-effective technology, then it really gets quite hot, because then obviously you then got the ability to completely disconnect from the grid, and then you've obviously got risks of stranded assets and not being able to earn a sensible return off investments that you've already made.
Yeah.
So it is a real challenge, I think, and it's only going to become a bit more difficult as we go forward.
But I think we also heard this morning, it's a challenge not just the utilities, but I heard several of the oil companies are also facing up to this challenge. Are they going to be oil companies, or are they going to morph back into being energy companies in its broadest sense? So there's some interesting thoughts going on there as well.
And just as we just have a minute left, I mean, what's your final thought as to how successfully firms will be able to transition, or are we going to be seeing a really disruptive revolution in energy?
I actually believe we're probably seeing a really disruptive evolution in energy, because we're going to end up with, as I say, totally different kinds of business models from what we've had historically. I mean, even say something like an aggregator who's coming in and leasing rooftop storage on a large scale, creating a virtual power station. We wouldn't have expected that, a few years ago. How those are financed through yield cos and green bonds and other things, different from what we've seen before. So there's a lot of things happening, not just on the technological side, but on the business model side at the same time. And I think we're going to see some pretty interesting developments.
Exciting times.
Yes.
Depending which side of the fence you're on.
I think no matter which side of the fence you're on, it's exciting. It's whether it's nauseating or not, I think this is maybe something.
Okay, thank you very much. In a moment, I'd like to ask you to thank David. We can also round that into a round of applause for the Germans, because they didn't get any last time. But before we offer our round of applause, I will say it really is now time for tea, and please be back by 4:10. Thank you.